Welcome to Lantern and Olive. Tonight, a quiet retelling from the Odyssey. For sleep, let's begin. Another day dawned over the palace of Ithaca, soft light filtering through the high windows of the great hall. Odysseus, still wrapped in his beggar's disguise, had passed the night in a corner near the hearth, sleeping lightly as a sailor sleeps, alert to every sound and movement around him. Now he watched as the household stirred to life. Servants beginning their morning tasks, the smell of bread baking drifting in from the kitchens. The suitors would not wake for hours yet, sleeping off the previous night's excesses. This quiet time belonged to the servants, to the faithful ones who kept the house running despite the noise of its many guests. He watched them work, noting their tired faces, their careful movements, the way they glanced at one another with shared understanding. They were waiting too, he understood. Waiting for something to change. Waiting for the master who had been gone so long. As the morning progressed, the suitors began to emerge, bleary-eyed and demanding. The noise level rose steadily, voices overlapping, laughter too loud, the voices of men who had grown too comfortable in another's house. The stranger stayed in his corner, patient and watchful. The scent of wood smoke and old stone settling around him. There were small trials throughout the day, moments of discourtesy from men who had forgotten the old ways of hospitality. But he let it all pass over him like wind over water, unchanged by their careless words, patient as the stone walls that had stood for generations. The fire in the great hearth had burned low, its embers glowing like distant memories. The afternoon light grew amber and warm, dust motes drifting lazily through the shafts of sun. For a long moment, everything was still. And then something happened that made his heart warm beneath his careful composure. Word came that the queen was descending from her chambers. Penelope, his wife of 20 years, the woman who had waited with such steadfast faith, was coming down to address the suitors. He saw her before she saw him. She appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in simple elegance, her face composed and beautiful despite the weariness around her eyes. Time had touched her gently, adding depth rather than diminishment, like a fine wine growing more precious with age. She moved with unhurried grace, a veil partially covering her features, her bearing that of a queen who had never forgotten her worth, despite the circumstances that surrounded her. The suitors fell silent at her appearance, their boasting replaced by awkward posturing. Each hoped to catch her eye, to win her favor, to convince her that he was worthy of being the next lord of this great house. But she looked through them as if they were shadows, her attention fixed on matters only she could see. She spoke to them with cool courtesy, reminding them of the ancient laws of hospitality that they had so thoroughly forgotten. She spoke of her absent husband, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of grief that had never fully healed. And she spoke of the choices she must soon make, the pressure she could not forever resist. He listened with his heart in his throat. How he longed to rise, to throw off his disguise, to take her in his arms and end her long vigil, with the 3 words she had waited 20 years to hear. But the time was not yet right. And so he stayed in his corner, the wool of his cloak warm against his arms, the scent of olive oil from the lamps drifting through the hall. He held his love in silence. Later, as evening fell and the torches were lit, the queen sent for the mysterious beggar. She had heard of his arrival, of the way he had borne the suitor's discourtesy with steady dignity, and her curiosity was stirred. Perhaps this stranger carried news. Perhaps he had heard something in his wanderings, some word of the husband she still believed would return. They met in a small chamber away from the noise of the hall. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting warm light that softened the shadows and created an island of peace in the troubled house. She sat in a carved wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes searching the stranger's face for some sign of truth. He sat across from her, maintaining his disguise, his old man's voice, his humble bearing. But being so close to her, speaking directly with her for the first time in 20 years, tested his composure more than any trial he had faced in all his wanderings. The fire shifted in the hearth, sending a thread of cedar smoke through the room. She asked about his travels, about the lands he had seen, and the stories he had heard. The wanderer chose his words with care. He spoke of a man he claimed to have met long ago, a great warrior named Odysseus, who had been detained on his journey home, but who was, even now, making his way back to Ithaca. He was alive, this stranger assured the queen. He would return. She should not abandon hope. She listened with an expression that was difficult to read. She had heard such assurances before, from other travelers eager to please with hopeful tales. Yet something in this stranger's voice, something in the details he provided, stirred a feeling she had almost forgotten. She hardly dared believe it, yet after all these years, after so many disappointments, something in her began to stir. She wept then, quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks like rain on a window pane. He watched her weep and felt his own eyes burn with unshed tears. How much they had both suffered. How much they had both lost. How much they had both kept faith through the long, dark years of separation. When her composure returned, Penelope offered the stranger the hospitality he deserved. She called for a servant to wash his feet and prepare a comfortable bed. But not just any servant. She summoned Eurycleia, the old nurse who had cared for Odysseus since his infancy, who loved him as a mother loves her child. Eurycleia came with a basin of warm water, grumbling softly about beggars and late nights, but performing her task with the thoroughness of long practice. She knelt before the stranger and lifted his foot into the water, her practiced hands beginning their work. And then her hands grew still. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers had found something, a scar, a distinctive mark on the stranger's thigh, left long ago by the tusk of a wild boar during a hunt in his youth. She knew that scar. She had tended that wound. She had watched it heal on the leg of the boy she had raised. The water in the basin trembled, small ripples catching the firelight. Eurycleia's hands remained frozen where they were as she looked up into the stranger's face. And now She saw through the disguise, through the years, through everything. She saw the child she had nursed, the young man she had watched sail away, the master of this house who had finally come home. He caught her by the wrist before she could cry out. His eyes held hers with a stillness that asked for silence. "Not yet," his gaze said, "not here. The time will come, but not yet. Trust me." And Euryclea, who had kept faith for 20 years, who had never stopped believing, who had loved him all her life, swallowed her joy and her relief and nodded once, slowly. She understood. She would wait. She would keep this secret until the moment it could be spoken aloud. She finished washing his feet in silence, her hands trembling but her face composed. When she was done, she looked at him once more, her eyes bright with tears she would not shed, and withdrew without a word. But in that look was everything. Welcome, love, hope, and a joy that needed no words. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing coals. The chamber was hushed, wrapped in the kind of stillness that comes when something profound has passed between two souls. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere across the hills, an owl began its call. The queen, noticing nothing unusual, bid the stranger good night and retired to her chambers. She would dream that night of ships returning, of familiar faces in crowds, of a voice she had not heard in so long calling her name with love. In the morning, she would dismiss the dreams as wishful thinking. But some part of her, deep beneath conscious thought, would begin to prepare for what was to come. The wanderer remained by the dying fire, alone with his thoughts. The embers glowed low, glowing with warmth. The chamber held the scent of wood smoke and lamp oil. Outside, the night had grown deep and still, the kind of stillness that settles over a house when all its souls have found their rest. Outside, the night was deep and still. The moon had set, leaving only stars to light the darkness. Somewhere in the house, Penelope slept her fitful sleep. Somewhere, Telemachus lay awake, thinking of the future. Somewhere, Euryclea clutched her secret to her heart like a treasure beyond price. And in the great hall, in the shadowed corner he had made his own, the wanderer sat in patient vigil. The years of wandering, the trials and sorrows, the long journey home, all of it had led to this quiet night, this peaceful hour. He was here. He was home. That was enough for now. But tonight, there was only the waiting. Only the slow breathing of the household in sleep. Only the gentle pop and hiss of embers settling in the hearth. Tonight, there was patience, that hard-won virtue that had carried him through so much. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. He wrapped his cloak around himself and let his eyes close. In his dreams, he walked through his own halls without disguise, greeted by the joyful cries of those who loved him. In his dreams, Penelope ran to meet him, and their embrace lasted forever. In his dreams, he was home at last, and nothing would ever separate them again. And outside, the night moved slowly toward dawn, carrying with it the quiet that comes before morning. And so the story rests for now. The fire has settled to embers. The wind has grown still. Somewhere the sea continues its ancient song, steady as breathing, patient as sleep. Let yourself drift. Let yourself rest. The story will be here when you return,